Are the United States and Saudi Arabia quietly drawing closer? It's been nearly a year since we were in Jeddah covering that frosty fist bump between Joe Biden and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Critics quick to evoke memories of 9/11, the brutal war in Yemen, the murder of dissident Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Biden's hosts irked by what they view as patronizing lecturing on how to run a kingdom. Fast forward to the present, and even though the Saudis have just normalized ties with Iran, announced a further 10% cut in oil output starting next month, Secretary of State Antony Blinken front and center and all smiles for 3 days of talks and summitry. Coincidence of the calendar? As Blinken was touching down in Jeddah, the Saudis were making their shock entry into the U.S. sports market with the merger of the breakaway LIV Golf Tour with the PGA. Sportswashing? Or a significant strengthening of the historic bonds that still tie allies in areas like defense and energy. Today in the France 24 debate, are U.S.-Saudi relations out of the rough? With us from the Saudi capital, Riyadh commentator and political researcher Salman Al-Ansari. Welcome back to the show.
Merci beaucoup, Francois.
Retired U.S. diplomat William Jordan is with us. You were once upon a time based in Dhahran.
That's right.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks as well to Anne Gadel, Middle East analyst at the Jean Jaurès Foundation think tank. How are you?
Good, thanks.
And from Washington, Mohammed Salman, Director of Strategic Technology at the Middle East Institute think tank. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Francois.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. What's a weekend pastime like golf compared with superpower rivalries and great game geopolitics? Well, perhaps burying the hatchet between rival professional circuits is more than just a parable for the general mood between Riyadh and Washington. Let's start with what is kind of a sports story, kind of a business story, kind of a politics story with Leo McGuinn.
Teeing off into a new era. The golfing world was rocked on Tuesday as the PGA Tour announced a merger with the Saudi-backed LIV Golf. The agreement also includes the DP World Tour. The shock announcement comes after an acrimonious split in the game just over a year ago, which saw LIV lure several top golfers away from the PGA by offering huge sums of money. Six-time major champion Phil Mickelson was one of the first to defect. He signed a bumper contract reportedly worth upwards of $200 million in June of last year. Players such as Mickelson and former world number one Dustin Johnson were indefinitely suspended by the PGA Tour for playing in LIV events. They could now have a path to return. For those involved in forming the merger, there is no doubt that the time was right to do so.
There is no question, this united front has the potential to positively shape the future of golf.
How are you guys doing this evening?
LIV is bankrolled by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, which has led to many accusing the country of sportswashing, the practice of using sports to improve a reputation tarnished by a dismal human rights record. Two players who stuck by the PGA Tour are Rory McIlroy and Tiger Woods, even though both were reportedly offered hundreds of millions of dollars to join LIV. Despite that, neither man was consulted before the merger was announced.
Obviously, Tiger and Rory's perspective is one that I understand very well. And it was part of my thinking throughout these conversations, and it will be a part of my thinking going forward. And now that we're in a framework agreement, I look forward to talking to all of our players, including the two of them.
The agreement puts an end to the pending litigation between the tours that would have gone to court next year.
Mohammed Salman, I don't know how much of an avid golf fan you are, but how big a deal is this where you are in Washington?
It's a big deal. It's a really big deal. I mean, this is a legacy sport. Americans love it. It's a cornerstone to the American sports legacy. It's a big win, clearly, for LIV League. However, I don't want to jump into conclusion. We still have to see how the DOJ and the FTC will react to the deal from a monopoly and antitrust standpoint.
All right, so jury's still out. Salman al-Ansari, there were reactions of almost celebration I saw in parts of Saudi Arabia after this merger announcement.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, one of the things I actually want to mention with regards to the narratives and the coverage of this deal, it is very unfortunate hearing this word, short or sport washing, etc. So sport washing as if it's something that Saudi Arabia actually needed to do. And I don't think the Saudi government and society take the US media seriously anymore. And how can we take them seriously if they are now arguing what a woman is? And it's actually a waste of time arguing with the media machine that is not in touch with reality. And it actually considers facts as its own enemy. I actually want to mention this, before the era of Mohammed bin Salman, we were called by the US media as rigid and ultra-conservative. And now, when Mohammed bin Salman opened up the society, and did the right thing for the young women and men in the field of sports, they called it sports washing. And when Mohammed bin Salman decided to bring about the biggest forestation project in the world by planting 40 billion trees in the Middle East, they called it greenwashing. And when he worked on empowering women in Saudi Arabia, they called it a propaganda to whitewash the human rights record. And when also Mohammed bin Salman cracked down on the extremists and radicals, they called it religious intolerance.
So you're saying it's a bias against against Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely, insanity, and damn if you do and damn if you don't. So the best way to confront, I would call it Saudi phobia, is to basically laugh at it and keep moving forward. And Saudi Arabia is very committed to bring about a complete reform system when it comes to every field, either in sport, in space, in technology, in AI, in every field. And that's the mission of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And
let's stick with sports for the time being. First of all, we could listen to one of the most outspoken critics of this breakaway tour. Rory McIlroy says he still, quote, hates LIV, but the former world number one can live with this merger.
At least the PGA Tour now controls how that money is spent. So if you're thinking about one of the biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world, would you rather have them as a partner or an enemy? At the end of the day, money talks, and you'd rather have them as a partner.
William Jordan, your reaction?
Well, I have a very cynical reaction as far as a lot of the international professional sports and all the dollars sloshing around. It doesn't matter whether. I think I take less exception to the idea of this merger in terms of the transformation of professional golf. I do think that there is a certain amount of sports washing or a certain amount of attempt by the Saudis to forcefully insert themselves into this and make themselves players on the international stage. I mean, and we're already seeing some of this emerge in terms of professional football.
But this is more than just a vanity project. This could actually be a money maker.
Yeah, and it may be one of the few things that, in terms of the baubles, that not just this current regime in Saudi Arabia, but preceding regimes have spent a lot of money on. It could actually be one that far from, for example, this Neom city that MBS or Mohammed bin Salman is pushing to have built up in the northwestern coast of Saudi Arabia. This could actually net revenue. It's a smart move. It represents, I think, a shrewd play by the Saudis in terms of not just the things that they've been doing politically or geopolitically lately, and how they've been working to undermine, any attempts by the United States, for example, to review and recalibrate its relationship. This is a smart move, and in some ways, what's happening in terms of forcing the PGA to back down and to merge with LIV Golf is very representative of what's been happening in the U.S.-Saudi political and economic and security relationship. So to me, I'm less worried about this, mostly because I have such a jaded view of professional golf anyway. It's a lot of money sloshing around. Who's actually in control of it? doesn't matter to me so much as the idea.
Okay, that's golf. Let's talk about football. And yes, Lionel Messi won't be going to the Saudi domestic league. He's going to Miami instead. But Saudi Arabia dominating the sports pages this week with the signings by domestic league club Al Ittihad of Ballon d'Or winner Karim Benzema from Real Madrid, his former France teammate N'Golo Kanté coming over from Chelsea as well. And of course, Angadel, Saudi Arabia, which wants to host the 2030 World Cup.
Well, money talks, as it was said during the report. Money talks, and that's actually a key to understand the late investments that Saudi Arabia has done in many sectors. It's the latest of many investments in sports and in entertainment. And it's no chance because, Saudi leaders see that investing in sports has a massive return on investment.
It's a return on investment.
They see what happened in Qatar during the World Cup. They see the massive return on investment, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of soft power, of image. And that's actually key.
And it's working.
That's actually key. I mean, it's working. You said it yourself. Saudi Arabia has been dominating the headlines with sports, not other kinds of stories. And I think the key thing to understand is that what they're trying to achieve, what they're in a hurry to achieve, is actually economic diversification. And this diversification, laid out by Vision 2030 plan, is based on services and tourism. So they're in desperate need of attracting investment and attracting attention and attracting tourists in Saudi Arabia.
And do you think it's something that's attainable?
I mean, look at the attention it attracted, this news. I don't know, to be honest, I'm not a football fan, so I really can't say anything about that to that regard. But what's absolutely certain is that they're not only investing in sports, they're really also focusing on entertainment, on culture. And it's a very, very visible move, a very, very visible shift of the Saudi techniques, the diplomacy. It's absolutely certain that they are moving forward a certain goal, and it's achieving their economic development plan.
And at the heart of it is a sovereign wealth fund, $700 billion worth. The chair of it is called Yasser Al Rumayyan. He has trusted some powerful posts. He's also chair of the national oil company, Saudi Aramco. He's the chair of Newcastle United Football Club. They're delighted in the north of England. They're qualified for next year's Champions League. The New York Times reports that the real power behind the purse strings is, according to analysts, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who chairs that sovereign wealth fund known as the Public Investment Fund. Mohammed Salman, this foray into soft power, are you surprised by it?
No, and I mean, I lived in Saudi Arabia for the last 2 years between DC and Jeddah, and I have seen the changes. And I'm going to give you what's my framework to understand what's happening in Saudi Arabia. There is a new leadership in the kingdom that believes that Saudi Arabia should be a G20 modern society, diversified economy powered by technology. That also is estimated by the fact they understand that the era of expensive oil might be bygone, so they need to diversify today. They need to make sure that they're investing in initiatives and sectors that can have return on investment that benefit the society. So back to your original question, I'm not really surprised. We have seen the Saudis bringing Formula One to Jeddah. We have seen their investment in football and now golf. They are aspiring to host the World Cup in 2030. So clearly there is a plan, a strategy. The leadership is very committed. They're also putting a lot of resources behind that, like you said. And I think what they're looking for is making sure that Saudi Arabia is okay, can stand on its own globally in this era of geopolitical instability.
Yeah, and it's happening at a time, and you wonder, is it a question? How deep are the pockets? I guess is the question, Mohammed, for these Saudi investors, particularly as the price of oil has dipped.
I mean, that's a challenge. I mean, they are not really blind to the fact that prices are going to be going through a distress cycle. Part of it is a global demand. also right now there's a reverse OPEC. It's not really only about producers of oil, it's also about consumers of oil and how they are also setting some cap on prices. I think there is, so far, the committed resources. They have a PIF, they have committed financial budgets behind these diversification programs, and their goal is to have return on investment immediately, so they're able to make the long-term case.
And that brings us to the news of the day, a full agenda for the visiting U.S. Secretary of State after a late-night meeting Tuesday with the Crown Prince on his arrival, and a Wednesday meeting of Gulf Cooperation Council foreign ministers. Antony Blinken attending this Thursday a meeting of the Global Coalition Against ISIS. Has the Biden administration, as we talked about at the outset, turned the page on calling out the Saudis on human rights? Well, listening to Blinken, there seems to be movement.
Progress on human rights strengthens our relationship. We will continue to underscore, both publicly and privately, the importance that we place on human rights and fundamental freedoms.
What's changed, Salman al-Ansari, since Joe Biden visited Jeddah last July?
Yeah, I think one of the things that changed dramatically is the rhetoric, basically. And we remember just yesterday, John Kirby was asked about the U.S. administration's opinion about the Saudi production cut. He literally said that he leaves the topic to the Saudis to comment about this, and he didn't allude to a specific kind of policy of the United States. That's a good development, not like before when they kept threatening with measures, etc. And the Saudis, I believe, managed to neutralize the U.S. when it comes to the kingdom's sovereign energy policy decisions. That in itself is very important, because at the end of the day, every country should have its own sovereignty with regards to the decisions it takes. And Saudi Arabia has proven to the world that all its decisions with regards to OPEC and OPEC Plus have been there to stabilize the market. And John Kirby himself said the price didn't even go up. So the Saudis are not targeting a high price. They are targeting mainly to lower the fluctuations of oil. That's number one. Number two, the U.S. is the major strategic security partner of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I think this will remain for decades to come. Yes, we've had a lot of setbacks. We've had a lot of problems with regards to the far left agendas, with regards to the way they viewed the Middle East, with regards to the way they have actually handed the region to the radical Iranian regime. And right now, the Saudis have found a way through which they can actually mitigate the risk of having a clash with the Iranians through the Chinese. Does that mean this will go against the U.S. interests? Not at all whatsoever. It actually goes for the interest of the United States, because they will be focusing mostly on the nuclear deal or the nuclear issue rather than the hostile activities of the Iranian regime.
You're calling it the radical Iranian regime. The Iranians reopening their embassy in Saudi Arabia this week. To the outside world, it looks like Saudi Arabia today has warmer relations with Tehran than Washington, for certain.
Absolutely. I represent myself at the end of the day. And I see the Iranian regime to be definitely a radical regime. And definitely we need to see some actions from them that have been, I hope, have been guaranteed by the Chinese to make them a moderate, normal nation that behave in a normal manner, rather than just supporting militias here and there. That's number one. Number two, going back to the U.S.-Saudi relations. As I said, it is very important. The U.S. is the second trading partner for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, and the biggest in the Middle East and North Africa for the United States. So at the end of the day, these two countries are indispensable to each other for different reasons. I said it earlier that both countries fought communism together, and they both fought terrorism together, and they both stabilized the global economy together. So the idea of having a split between Riyadh and DC is not going to be for the interest of nor Saudi Arabia, nor the United States, nor for global security and global economic prosperity. That's for sure.
It brings us back, William Jordan, a little bit, though, to our golfing parable. After all, Donald Trump, a big supporter of the LIV Golf Tour. And there is this feeling that there's an element of domestic U.S. politics involved in this U.S.-Saudi relationship. Less so now? than it was a year ago?
Well, look, the domestic political aspect of the U.S.-Saudi relationship for the United States has always been there. I mean, going back to when I started in the State Department in the early 1980s, you had racking discussions and debates and arguments about, selling the Saudis AWACS planes and F-15 fighters and a lot of the advanced weaponry that a lot of people in Washington thought would undermine the overall security balance because it threatened Israel and because the Saudis couldn't really be trusted because we were only a few years after the oil embargo during the 1973 war. So this has always been there. And, you cycle through all of the various things that include, the September 11 attacks, and the bile that was vented upon Saudi Arabia as a result of that. I think the problem in the United States has always been that the United States government, with the support of the Congress, has needed to recalibrate a whole slew of its relationships in the region. The region is changing. The problem is the United States in terms of how it views the region and how it wants to remain the principal partner of countries like Saudi Arabia has not changed. And that's what I see happening is that Biden has basically, despite the strong rhetoric that he used rather clumsily during the presidential campaign in 2020, has now had to pull it back because the people around him and in the State Department are saying, and in the Pentagon and in the CIA are saying, no, we can't actually break and recalibrate this relationship. I mean, I think we need to. We should not be the primary strategic partner of Saudi Arabia.
But when you hear Salman al-Ansari say major strategic partners for decades to come, you agree?
It shouldn't be, there's a
Why shouldn't it be?
Because we don't have fundamentally the same views on things, and I think that. And I don't mean this to be critical of Saudi Arabia. I mean this to be critical of the United States. I actually think that what Saudi Arabia has been doing vis-a-vis the readmission of Syria, even though I have very strong views about the need to maintain isolation of Syria, but Saudi Arabia doing what it's done to help or to achieve the readmission of Syria to the Arab League by allowing Chinese mediation to facilitate this rapprochement with Iran, by whether it was with or without American encouragement, bring an end or try to change things with the conflict in Yemen, so that is no longer a liability for Saudi Arabia. These are all very important things. These realignments.
So you agree
critical.
with that?
I agree with all of that because I think that Saudi Arabia needs to assert its independence of the United States and any other great powers. But that leaves the United States then having to figure out, well, what kind of a relationship do we have with this change in Riyadh?
And Gadel, the United States, going on the record, is saying they do not object to Saudi Arabia normalizing relations with Iran and Syria, particularly with, as William Jordan just said, a view to ending the nightmare for Yemen.
Well, first of all, I would like to comment on the fact that I don't really agree on the fact that the U.S. software regarding the Middle East hasn't changed. I think it has changed. I think the U.S. administration, there was this rough patch that the relationship has gone through at the beginning of the term of the Biden term. Now there's sort of this visit is a sort of is to be held within a global maneuver to sort of reverse the tendency to mend ties, to actually mend ties. But I think the U.S. also has a different view. It sees the region differently. It's not actually disengaging. It's just wanting to empower regional powers to take a more active part in building dialogue. That's what they're doing. That's what they've been doing with the Abraham Agreements. And I think that's actually a big part. It was actually a big issue.
The Abraham Agreements were normalizing relations between Israel and Arab states.
Exactly. And I think that's what that was one of Blinken's main items during this trip. I think it was really to discuss this specific issue.
What, to try to convince Saudi, because I've heard this, to try to convince Saudi Arabia to
sort of join,
to normalize ties with Israel.
To join the movement.
Before I go to Mohammed Salman al-Ansari, is that going to happen anytime soon?
With regards to Saudi, Israeli normalization. I strongly believe that the current US administration isn't as interested to broker a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, despite definitely Secretary Blinken's comments about it and how it's linked to US national security, etc. And I'm saying this for three reasons. First, the US administration has a very serious disagreement and a real problem with Prime Minister Netanyahu due to his judicial reforms and the land annexations of the Palestinian territories in the West Bank. And definitely, and the second thing is any move with regards to the Abraham Accord will somehow give the real credit to the previous administration, since President Trump and Jared Kushner engineered it. Third is the fact that the US genuinely wants to see, the US and specifically the current Democratic Party, which is a good thing, that they genuinely wants to see the two-state solution to materialize. But the problem is that they lack decisiveness and resolve with both parties, the Palestinians and the Israelis. And I think the US ideal situation is to have Saudi-Israel normalization plus the two-state solution, which is also the ideal position and situation for the kingdom. So when it comes to the US realistic situation is to bring in some trust-building moves between the kingdom and Israel, such as the previous Saudi decision to open its airfield to civilian Israeli planes. The talk now is definitely to allow Israeli planes to land in Jeddah for the Israeli Muslims to perform pilgrimage in Mecca. But that's merely to tick the box for the US and show that they have done something positive in the Middle East, not other than that.
Mohammed Salman, what's higher on the agenda, you think, for Antony Blinken? Yemen, as William Jordan stated, or perhaps Israel, as Anne Gadel pointed out?
Well, I'm going to take a distant view. I think we are living in a moment in DC where the Indo-Pacific is absorbing all the air strategically. Second to that comes the Ukrainian file and the situation in Europe overall. And then third is the Middle East as a theater. His visit to the Gulf is to reassure allies and partners the United States is there, committed, but the United States would be committed based on its own national interests, and this national interest would be much more defined, would be mostly about counterterrorism, keeping a sea lane open, making sure that there is a supply line of energy to stabilize the global economy, and that's mostly it. He did not come to Jeddah with new promises. It's more of trying to rebuild the trust in the relationship.
So you're putting energy top of the agenda.
I would say that, and part of it is not because, I mean, as we know, the United States is, from an energy standpoint, is strategically independent as a producer. But Washington still care about energy as a cornerstone for global growth, and this is very important for the American economy. So it's still going to be very important to the United States' strategic interest. On top of that, I would say there has been some sort of diplomatic vacuum in the last year in the Gulf region specifically. We have seen the Chinese mediation, even though China is trying to take more credit than it should be. However, that's still, from optical standpoint, is a problem. We also have seen intensifying Russian diplomatic activities in the region. So him being there and National Security Advisor Sullivan also being there a few weeks ago, trying to reassure the United States still care about the region, because also, again, Gulf capitals understand that the priorities have shifted in DC. This is not 2003. This is 2023. Ukraine and Taiwan are the top priorities for the Biden team and for whoever is going to be the occupant of the White House.
Yeah, so the White House, so the Biden administration, again, as we said, not objecting to this normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran and subsequently with Syria. And also Antony Blinken arriving in the kingdom just days after that announcement of more oil production cuts. The last time the Saudis led the charge in curbing oil production, the U.S. protested loudly. Back then, this was a barrel of crude cost nearly double what it did this past weekend when the Saudis announced that further 10% cut in output starting next month. This is the graph showing you what oil has done in the past year. Plus, you can add to that, Anne Gadel, the fact that U.S. domestic production of oil is at record levels. So with the price at the pump in the U.S. a little bit lower than it was a year ago, is this less of an issue, oil cuts at OPEC?
It may be less of an issue, but I actually agree with Mohammed Salman. Actually, the domestic issues were actually prominent in the agenda during this visit as well. It may be less of an issue because of what you mentioned, but in the long run, it's a trust issue actually, and if Saudi Arabia and OPEC Plus actually keeps on cutting output, it's going to create a problem. So obviously, the issue. The idea behind the trip was to mend ties and to reassure Saudi partners that the relation is, they're trying to patch up actually. They're actually patching up the relationship, and domestic issues, including oil prices, were actually on the agenda. Yeah.
William Jordan, the predictions from analysts is that those oil prices, which are now around $73 a barrel, will slowly start to creep up during the second half of this year. If they go up just before the presidential election, does that go back to the top of the in tray for the Americans?
Probably, or it'll be another cudgel that the Republican Party will wield against the Biden administration, and it will point to its rather feckless and ineffective, as they will portray it, dealings with Saudi Arabia on this very crucial issue. I mean, I think one of the things, the point was made that the United States is the major energy producer, but that doesn't mean that the United States is energy independent. I mean, the reality in the United States has been that for decades, and this goes actually back to ructions in the oil market that started in the 1970s and persisted and totally changed the nature of the oil industry, the international oil industry in the 1980s. American oil companies basically disinvested or stopped investing in infrastructure, critical infrastructure in the United States, to where the United States can produce oil and gas out the wazoo, but it doesn't have the infrastructure to be able to refine it, move it around the country, and consequently is still heavily dependent on international sources of oil in order regionally to fill in the gap here and there. This is what makes the American oil market, in addition to the reluctance of the oil companies not to cater only to a closed national market. This is all what makes the American oil market or gas price so market sensitive. And I think that, to get back to the main point here, I believe that what is going on with the Biden administration is inertia that is causing it to fall back because it really doesn't have any alternatives to the status quo, the long-running status quo, the long-running paradigm that, as was mentioned earlier, goes back to the Cold War of how to deal with Saudi Arabia and other key partners in the Sunni Arab world. This is not, in my view, a mending of fences. It's an attempt to just continue to recite the same cant, the same line over and over again to reassure the Saudis, because talking about the trust issue, the real trust issue for the Saudis, they want the Americans to love them. They want the Americans to be their best friend. They want that constant reassurance. They need to be stoked because the Saudis on a certain level are insecure because they know that if suddenly the $140 billion in U.S. foreign military sales dried up and went away, Saudi Arabia would be basically defenseless, and it would find itself in the situation it was in the 1960s and the 1970s, where it needed outside powers to step in and to do the work for it. And it doesn't want to lose the United States as the mercenary or the provider of the weaponry, as well as, if necessary, the troops on the ground to be able to take care of all of these things. It needs that ultimate guarantee. But that's not something that works out to the Americans' advantage, because the vulnerabilities in terms of the possible disruption of the American oil market and the rise in gas prices that engenders, and inflation and
so
everything else.
So the two sides need each other.
Right.
Salman al-Ansari Right now, relations are better between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Of course, things wax and wane. Whose job is it? When you heard earlier Mohammed Salman talking about energy security, whose job is it to police the waters around Saudi Arabia, particularly the Strait of Hormuz?
Yeah, I think the best way to do so is to do it collectively with the regional powers and also internationally. As I said earlier, the United States is the strategic most important security partner, and they will remain to be so, unless if they change their mind, which is not something that is expected. And with regards to Iran, I think the Saudis, there's actually like a proverb by someone, Laird Hamilton, I think. They said, make sure your worst enemy doesn't live between your own ears. So I think the Saudis are actually kind of having this approach of having this model of development in Saudi Arabia and in the region, and they don't want to have an obstacle to that development plan. So that's why they wanted to have peace with the Iranians. But definitely that peace needs to be tested right now, because the thing that Saudi Arabia has put, Saudi Arabia actually wanted to have this peace because they can see that there is an outcome that is good for the security of Saudi Arabia because the Chinese have stepped in and became like the guarantor. That's with regards to the thing with Iran. And there is one other thing. Let's not forget what the former president of the United States, President Obama, when he had this, he said this, he threw this bombshell statement when he said at the Atlantic that the Saudis and the Iranians should share the region. So it is very kind of interesting to see how the current US administration is kind of concerned about what happened, even though President Biden used to be the vice president of Obama, who actually advocated for sharing the region, even though Saudi Arabia actually disagrees with that statement completely, because every country has its own sovereignty. That's number one. Number two, with regards to the oil, etc., and it is very important to know that Saudi Arabia is definitely the central bank of energy. It is true that the US is the biggest producer right now, but at the same time, OPEC and OPEC Plus is managed somehow by the kingdom. And it is actually very funny when I see it's amusing when I see some analysts claimed that Saudi Arabia is helping Russia when they enacted the production cut. The fact is that Russia wanted to increase their production, not lower it. Yeah, Saudi Arabia was the one who wanted to lower it. So Russia and the US had the same objective. And our Saudi media didn't say the Russians are colluding with the US against our interest. It's the same logic. So we need to get ahead and just get away from these kind of ideas of conspiracies, etc., and look at the Saudi as the stabilizer of the energy market. Why? Because before the war, all the experts were expecting a price that can reach $140 US. And look what OPEC Plus has done. It's right now around $77. So they managed to lower the prices of oil. They managed to stabilize the oil prices. They managed to reduce the fluctuations of the oil price. That should be applauded rather than just being criticized for some conspiracy kind of ideas that do not have merit.
So, Salman rightly pointing out it's not OPEC that met in Vienna last weekend, but OPEC Plus, which includes Russia. Mohammed bin Salman following up from last weekend with a phone call on Wednesday with Vladimir Putin. A readout of it from the Kremlin says that they praised cooperation. This was happening, of course, Mohammed Salman, while Antony Blinken was in Saudi Arabia. Your thoughts on that OPEC Plus meeting last weekend?
My position is as follows. I think here in Washington, we should go beyond the idea of unipolar moment. There are many great players that exist, and middle powers and regional powers want to establish relationship with everyone, not at the expense of a third party. So back to the point about OPEC Plus, that framework is started because of the price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia. And actually, Washington has been trying to push for that sort of framework to stabilize the energy market. That's the framework has been in place. This is part of the...
Sorry, Mohammed, everybody seems to talk about this idea of stabilizing the price. Isn't it, if you're an oil producer, you just want a higher price?
I mean, at some point, you cannot really go that high that you distress demand. I mean, at that time, that price war happened during COVID pandemic when you had a complete shutdown. So stabilizing energy prices at the time was a strategic priority for everyone, either producer or a consumer. So that's my response to that question. Back to the OPEC Plus framework, that has been part of the Saudi foreign policy toolkit. It has been a very effective mechanism to manage oil production. And I agree with Salman on his point when it comes to the idea that it's helping Russia. I mean, the kingdom has been very clear about how they see or how they prioritize the energy policy more broadly. And I think for Washington, finally, they came to the conclusion that this has been a long-term Saudi policy regarding oil production with or without Russia or the Ukrainian war.
So they're able to differentiate the two. When Riyadh hosted the Arab League summit last month, it also welcomed, let's remember, a surprise guest speaker, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Was this, and Gadel, a case of striking a balance between Kyiv and Moscow, or a sign to Ukraine's biggest backer, the United States?
Actually, you mentioned the term balancing, and that's actually what I think, to some extent, Saudi Arabia is doing. Let's put it in perspective in this new...
Were you surprised to see Volodymyr Zelensky at the Arab League summit?
I was actually surprised, but it was a balance with the presence of Bashar al-Assad. So the framework within which it plays out is that Saudi Arabia is trying to navigate this new international order, and it doesn't want to alienate either Russia or the United States or China. They're sort of playing the field, and they're sort of trying to maneuver to get a more autonomous diplomacy. That's what they're doing. So they give tokens of goodwill, once to the United States, once to Russia, once to China. And I think they're sort of playing this balancing act. So,
and brings up an important point, thinking back to that summit. This was supposed to be Bashar al-Assad's big moment. Welcomed back to the Arab League after more than a decade, and he's upstaged by Ukraine's president. And that's the Saudis. Was that something calculated on their part?
I think it was meant to show to Washington and to others in the West that, yes, indeed, there's a great balancing act here. And I think that Anne's absolutely right. In fact, this is a point that I would really want to stress several times, is that there's a shifting order in the region. Saudi Arabia is right now doing a lot of things that, as I said, I would actually praise, because this is the sort of autonomy and the sort of boldness that in the international or in the regional field should be happening. It doesn't surprise me that he wants to do this. When you get back to the United States, it's the U.S. scrambling to try to catch up because of the frosty relationship that since the Biden administration has been engendered between Riyadh and Washington, and for very good reasons, and which should have, as I said earlier, led to a true review and recalibration of the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Now you have Washington doing the only thing that it can do, which is repeat the same things, the same formulas, the same empty blah, blah, blah that it's always, repeated as far as...
3 days in Riyadh, it's empty blah, 3 days in Saudi Arabia,
very
it's empty?
Well, that's what the secretaries of state do for a living. I mean, they spend a lot of time at banal, ridiculous, empty meetings that don't really accomplish very much. And it was very much a case of sucking up to the Saudis in a manner that made it clear that, hey, we still matter. We matter to you. We are, as Salman has been saying, your most important strategic partner. We want to be part of this because Washington feels, and it's correct, that the region is changing. And because it hasn't been adapting its policy and looking at all of its relationships in the region, it's being left behind.
It needs to be more forward-thinking, you're saying. So much more to talk about. William Jordan, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Anne Gadel. Salman Al-Ansari for being with us from Riyadh, Mohammed Salman in Washington. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you.